The bench groaned under Elena Vasquez the moment she sat on it, a sound so small it barely existed, but in the dead silence of the empty Whitmore Conservatory at 6:47 in the morning, it rang through her chest like a warning bell. Her hands were still damp from the cleaning cloth. Her cart sat 3 feet behind her, the mop handle leaning at a tired angle against the wall. The Steinway Concert Grand stretched before her, all 9 feet of it, black and enormous and waiting, and for the first time in 11 years, Elena was not standing beside it. She was sitting at it. She had 11 minutes before the first professor's car would appear in the parking lot. She knew this because she had watched that parking lot from the window of this very room every Tuesday and Thursday morning for nearly a decade. She knew which car came first. Dr. Gerald Hobbs' green Volvo, always 7 minutes early, always with a paper coffee cup in his left hand and a worn briefcase in his right. She knew which lights came on first in the faculty wing and in which order. She knew the sound the old elevator made when it reached the 3rd floor, a brief mechanical sigh followed by a click, as if the building were catching its breath. She knew which floorboards in the main corridor had the most give, which stretch of hallway smelled faintly of damp even in summer because of a pipe that had been repaired but never fully corrected, which window in the practice room corridor had a gap at its lower left corner that let in cold air when the wind came from the north. She had memorized this building the way a person memorizes a place they are not supposed to belong to carefully, from the outside, with the kind of attention paid by someone who understands the difference between belonging and being permitted to be present. She had been permitted to be present for 11 years. But today the building was empty. A burst pipe in the east wing had sent maintenance crews flooding in at 4 in the morning, and the conservatory director had sent an email to all faculty and students canceling morning access until further notice. Elena had not received that message because she was not on the faculty list and she was not a student. She was on a different list entirely, the one the building manager kept in a binder in his office, the one with names like hers on it, the kind of names that appeared on cleaning schedules and direct deposit records and the emergency contact sheets on the back of the supply room door, but never on concert programs, never on donor plaques, never on the small brass nameplates outside the faculty offices, never announced from a stage. She had walked in at 6:45 the same way she always did, through the side entrance with the narrow door that was slightly stiff in cold weather, with her cart. She had moved through the hallways in the early dark, turning on only the lights she needed as she went and turning them off behind her, the way she always did, conserving both electricity and presence. She had cleaned the 2 ground-floor practice rooms and the main corridor junction, and was making her way to the recital hall when she pushed open the heavy door and found the room completely, utterly, profoundly empty. No students occupying the side chairs, waiting out the minutes before their lesson slots. No professor at the Yamaha upright in the far corner with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a score spread open on the stand. No accompanist warming her hands around a paper cup and frowning at a passage she had not yet mastered. The hall was simply itself without anyone in it, which Elena had never seen. In 11 years she had never been alone in this room. She had always been cleaning while someone was present, or cleaning before they arrived, or cleaning after they left. But the hall itself had always contained the residue of human occupation, sound in the air, a coat on a chair, a thermos on the floor by the practice bench. Today there was nothing. Only the piano, only the still air, only the light coming gray and thin through the high windows. Elena had stood in the doorway for 41 seconds. She would remember this figure with unusual precision later, without knowing exactly how she knew it. Not because she had counted, but because the body knows time the way it knows other things, not consciously but completely in the cells. Then she had set her cart against the wall, walked across the polished floor and sat down at the bench. The bench was covered in dark brown leather, worn smooth in the center from years of use, and it was cold beneath her even through the fabric of her cleaning uniform. She had wiped this bench down hundreds of times. She knew the grain of its leather and the specific way it reflected light on cloudy mornings and the faint impression of use at its center where people had sat. She had never put her own weight on it. Her weight now made a small adjustment in the spring mechanism inside the cushioned top, a sound so quiet it was almost not a sound, but she heard it. The Prokofiev score was open on the music stand, exactly where it had been for the past 3 weeks. A student had left it there after a lesson and had not returned to retrieve it. Elena had dusted around it every time she cleaned the room. She had lifted it carefully with both hands, the way you lift a book that belongs to someone else to polish the stand beneath it, and had set it back in precisely the same position at precisely the same angle, open to the same page. Page 23. The first measure of the third movement. She had read the page each time she set the score back. She had read it the way you read something in a language you grew up speaking, and then set aside for reasons that had nothing to do with having forgotten it. She did not look at the score now, she did not need to. Her name, before everything changed, had been Alina Petrova. She had grown up in Kiev, in an apartment on the 5th floor of a grey building, where the walls were thin enough that she had fallen asleep for years to the sound of her downstairs neighbor practicing scales on a piano. She never saw but knew by sound as intimately as she knew any instrument she ever played. Her mother had been a music theory teacher at a local school, ear training, notation, harmony, the foundations of music as a structural discipline rather than a performed art. Her father had worked long shifts at a factory that made machine parts, and he came home with the smell of metal on his hands and ate his dinner in front of the television and on weekends played football in the courtyard with the neighborhood men, and he could not carry a tune and did not think about music except as something that came from radios and that his wife taught for income. Neither of them had expected Alina. When Alina was 4 years old, during a lunch break at her nursery school, she had sat down at the old upright in the music room and picked out a melody she had heard on the radio that morning while her mother made tea. She played it with both hands, all the right notes, the right rhythm, the right phrasing, intuited rather than learned, without having been shown. Without having sat at a piano before in her life. The music teacher had stood in the doorway of the music room for a long moment, and had then gone to the school office and used the telephone. And Alina's mother had stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and gone so still and so quiet that she did not even hear the kettle boiling until the steam hit the window. By the time Alina was 8, she was practicing 4 hours every day. By 12 it was 6. She had a real teacher by then, a woman named Mrs. Bondarenko who had studied at the Kiev Conservatory and who taught from a small room in her apartment that smelled of cold tea and music paper, and who had, in 30 years of teaching, encountered perhaps 3 students she considered genuinely extraordinary, and who placed Alina, without sentimentality and with full professional seriousness, among them. By 15, Alina was traveling to competitions in other cities, and coming home with certificates and occasionally medals, and rare small cash prizes that her parents kept in an envelope behind the utility bills in the kitchen drawer, as though the money were too significant to go in the ordinary places where money went. She was not considered by her teachers to be the most naturally gifted pianist they had ever taught. Natural gift was, at the level she had reached by 15, a common commodity. You did not reach that level without it. What was uncommon about Alina, what every teacher who worked with her eventually mentioned to her parents, to other teachers, among themselves in the corridors of competition venues, was the quality of her commitment. Not discipline, though she had that. Not diligence, though she had that too. Something more specific and harder to name. When Alina played, she played as if the music were the only thing in the world that was genuinely real at that moment. Not as if she were pretending everything else didn't exist, but as if she had simply, cleanly, stopped needing it to. The room, the audience, the temperature, the sounds from outside, the time, these things did not disappear. They simply ceased to be the point in the specific way that things cease to be the point when something more important is happening. Every note she played had the quality of a choice, not a choice made in real time, consciously, but a choice that had already been made so completely and finally that the music flowed from it without effort. She won her first significant competition at 17, her second at 19. At 21, she played the Prokofiev Piano Sonata No. 7 in the final round of the Kiev National Young Artists Competition, and she placed first. The selection had been considered extreme by the faculty panel when they learned of it in advance. The Prokofiev 7th was not what young competitors played to win. It was not playable adequately. It was a piece you either played with complete commitment and exceptional ability or you did not play at all. Several of Alina's colleagues and rivals had counseled her against it, not from competitive motives but from genuine concern. The piece had ended competitions for better prepared players than she. She had listened to their advice and thanked them for it, and played the piece she had decided to play. The third movement, the Precipitato, was the specific wall, 184 beats per minute, left hand thundering octave figures that required physical power sustained over the entire duration of the movement. Right hand operating with aggressive, meticulous precision while the left hand made its demands. The movement lasted 5 minutes and 44 seconds, and for those 5 minutes and 44 seconds there was nowhere to rest. no phrase that allowed the hands or the mind to breathe, no moment of relative ease. It was music written in 1944 during a time of great urgency, and it contained the quality of that urgency without apology. Alina had played it without hesitation. She had stood in the wings of the National Music Hall in Kiev, in a blue dress her mother had made from fabric bought at the weekend market, dark blue, simply cut, with a narrow collar that her mother had said made Alina look like a musician, and not like a girl trying to look like a musician, which was an important distinction. Alina had stood in the wings with her hands pressed flat against the sides of her thighs, an old habit, a way of settling herself before she walked on, and she had looked at the stage and at the bench and at the Steinway, and she had thought nothing at all. She had thought nothing because there was nothing to think. The piece was inside her. She was going to play it. That was the entirety of the situation. She walked on, she sat, she placed her hands in her lap. And then she played, and in the fourth row, a man named Dmitri Vasquez rose from his seat before the applause had finished beginning. She had met Dmitri 3 months before the competition. He had come to Kiev from Buenos Aires at the age of 20 to follow a girl who had not waited for him, and had stayed because the city had taken hold of him in the specific way certain cities take hold of certain people, through the peculiar winter light, through the food, through the particular sound of the language, through the sense of a place that had survived things and kept being itself anyway. He had joined a chamber ensemble. He had been practicing cello in the room next to the one Alina had booked at a rehearsal building near the city center, and when she played a phrase she was particularly proud of, he had knocked on the wall once. She had understood immediately. She had knocked back. From the other side she had heard him play the cello countermelody from a Shostakovich duo, a line that only fully existed in relation to the piano line she was playing. She had played her part back. The wall between them had become something musical. That was how it had started, and it was so perfectly them that neither of them ever tried to improve the story when they told it. They married when she was 23 and he was 25, small apartment near the river. A window that faced east and caught the morning light on the floor in a rectangle that moved as the hours passed. A keyboard Alina practiced on in the evenings with the volume low. A cello case in the corner of the bedroom that Dmitri had given a name to privately after a mountain in Patagonia. 4 years that were not prosperous or easy, and that were exactly what both of them wanted, in the way that the right thing is always exactly what you want even when you cannot explain the wanting. Then Dmitri began to be tired in a way that had a different quality from the tired that came from working and practicing and living. Alina noticed it before he spoke of it, because she paid attention to him the way she paid attention to music fully, and at the level where the details are not decoration but content. She noticed the way he set the bow down and sat with his hands in his lap. She noticed how he slept longer and woke less rested. She noticed the particular way he sometimes looked at his own hands, as if they were something he was checking on. The diagnosis came in autumn, 4 years into the marriage. She had sat beside him in the doctor's office and held his hand and received the information with the same quality of complete attention she gave everything, which meant she understood every word clearly, immediately, and without the buffer of denial. She understood what it meant. She understood what it would require. She understood that the life they had been living was about to change, and she understood before she left that office what she was going to do about it. She gave up touring without discussion. She gave up the performance schedule, the competition circuit, the slow building of the career that Mrs. Bondarenko had told her she had the ability to sustain. She did not deliberate. She did not make a list of options. The choice was made in the same moment the diagnosis was delivered, in the same way that certain choices are not really choices but recognitions. The understanding that there is only one thing you are ever going to do in this situation, and the situation has now arrived. She took whatever work she could do while staying near him. She tutored students. She accompanied at local events. She applied for visas to countries where treatment possibilities were better, and the visa applications moved through their processes at the pace of bureaucratic machinery that does not know and cannot be told that the person waiting for the result is watching someone she loves run out of time. He died on a March morning. The ice on the river was just beginning to break up. He was 30 years old. She had sat beside him and kept the promise she had made to herself not to make his last moments about her grief. She held his hand and sat still and was simply present without crying, because he had spent the last months worrying about her and she wanted him at the end to see her steady. She buried him. She packed what could be carried. She began the long work of building a life in a different country, which is one of the most demanding things a person can undertake, and which Alina undertook the way she undertook everything, completely, without holding part of herself back in full. The Whitmore Conservatory was chosen deliberately. She needed to be near music. That was not a preference but a condition. She understood herself well enough to know that she could not function healthily in a life that contained no music at all. The conservatory was the nearest music she could find employment at, and she had gone to the building manager's office and filled out the form and listed her experience and gotten the job. Under prior work experience on that form, she had written what was true for the form's purposes: general cleaning and domestic maintenance, various employers. She had not written the other things that were also true, not from dishonesty. The form did not have a line for who you had been before you were this, and the job she was applying for had no use for that information. She was not hiding, she was simply answering what was asked. The first morning she went in, she was shown around the building by the previous cleaning team member who was leaving, a quiet man named Harold who had worked there for 7 years, and who showed her the supply room and the schedule, and the particular requirements of each space with the practiced efficiency of someone who takes their work seriously. He showed her how to clean the piano, the chamois cloth, the direction of the stroke, the pressure required, the care around the pedals and the damper mechanisms. He told her the piano was the most important thing in the building and should be treated as such. She had nodded and listened and said she understood. She understood in ways he could not have known. She cleaned the conservatory every scheduled day for 11 years. She learned the building's rhythms and the faculty's habits and the particular flow of a place organized around the cycle of performance preparation, the weeks of intensive practice before a recital, the looser period after, the specific frantic quality of the days before major events. She knew the schedule better than some of the faculty did. She knew who practiced at what hour in which room. She knew which students were struggling and which were advancing, not from gossip, but from the simple information of sound traveling through walls and doors. She did not make herself known to any of it. She cleaned. She was quiet. She was efficient. She was, to everyone in the building who noticed her at all, invisible in the specific way that people become invisible when they are doing something that the building requires but that the building does not think about. The piano, though. Every Tuesday and Thursday she came to the recital hall and cleaned it, and the Steinway was there, and she dusted it with the chamois cloth as Harold had shown her. She had refined the technique over years into something that was its own kind of care, the particular pressure for the lacquer, the specific angle of the cloth around the curve of the lid, the individual attention she gave each key. At the end of each cleaning she rested her right hand flat on the keyboard, not pressing, not playing, just resting the full weight of her palm against the smooth, cool surface of the keys. She did this every time. She did not think consciously about why. She simply did it, and it was the only contact she allowed herself with the instrument, and she had made peace with its being enough. 3 weeks before the morning she sat down, a student had left the Prokofiev score on the stand. Oliver, she had seen him in the corridor, always slightly out of breath, leather satchel over one shoulder, the look of someone working on something bigger than he had yet fully grown into. She had recognized the score title immediately. She had lifted it to dust beneath it and set it back, and had stood for a longer moment than usual before picking up her cloth and moving on. She had come back the next visit and stood in front of the score and read it. The next visit she stood closer. The visit after that she had traced the opening measure with one fingertip, barely touching the paper. She was not playing, she was not even close to playing. She was doing something that did not have a name, that was somewhere between memory and permission. That was the first movement of something she did not yet know she was about to begin. The pipe burst, the building emptied. The parking lot was hers alone. She had 11 minutes. She sat down. She pressed her hands against her thighs. She felt them settle. Then she placed them on the keys. Middle C first. One note quietly to feel the action of the instrument. The Steinway's action was different from the keyboard at home, firmer, more responsive, the key returning to position with a precision that the cheaper instrument could not replicate. A good piano. She had always known it was a good piano. She had polished it for 11 years. She moved her hands into position, and she played the opening chord of the third movement, and the room opened around her, and she was not in the Whitmore Conservatory. She was 21 years old, and she was in the wings of the National Music Hall, and the light was warm, and the air smelled of old velvet and chalk, and Dmitri was in the 4th row, and the music was ahead of her like a country she had already memorized, and all she had to do was go there. She went there. The precipitato moved through the hall. Her left hand drove the octaves with full weight. She did not protect them, did not pull back, because there was no one here to witness a mistake, and so there was no reason to manage for safety. Her right hand drove forward at the tempo the piece demanded. Measure 47 came and her hands went through it as they had gone through it thousands of times, without argument, without the brain's interference, as a thing that the body had learned and stored and did not need to be reminded of. The final section built. The chord landed. She sat still. She heard a movement at the doorway, a shift of weight on the old floor. She stood, she reached for the cloth. She said, "I am sorry. I will be finished in just a few minutes," without turning, because in this building the correct response to being found somewhere unexpected was always to make yourself small first. The voice said, "Where did you study?" She turned around. Professor George Aldrin was a man who showed his life in his face, and he was standing in the doorway of the recital hall with a dark blue scarf around his neck, and an expression Alina did not immediately recognize because it was not the expression she had prepared herself to receive. He was 63. He had been a concert pianist until a nerve condition in his right arm at 38 had ended that chapter with the abruptness reserved for the worst losses, the ones that do not announce themselves in time to be prepared for. He had moved into teaching, and he had taught at the Whitmore Conservatory for 24 years, and he had produced 8 students who had gone on to professional careers, and he was considered among the faculty of 3 other conservatories to be one of the best piano teachers currently working in the country. He had come back to the building that morning for a scarf his daughter had knitted him. Dark blue, with a small imperfection near one end that she had pointed out apologetically on Christmas morning, and that he had since decided was the part of the scarf he liked best. He had left it on the hook behind his office door the previous afternoon. He had a dental appointment at 9, and he had thought about the scarf over breakfast, and had decided to retrieve it on his way, since faculty card access to the building had not been suspended during the pipe emergency. He had walked through the empty corridors with the ease of a man who had been walking through them for 24 years. He had retrieved the scarf from his office. He was on his way back toward the exit when he heard the piano. He had stopped walking at the top of the main staircase. His hand rested on the banister. He stood there for a moment in the way a person stands when their brain has received information that does not match expectation. The building was supposed to be empty of students and most faculty. The piano music he was hearing was coming from the recital hall. He had heard piano music from that hall 1,000 times in 24 years, students at every level from beginning to advanced, professionals rehearsing for events, his own students in the months and weeks of preparation for recitals. He had heard it all. He knew what the hall sounded like with a good student in it. He knew what it sounded like with a professional in it. He knew the difference, and he knew the gradations within each category. He did not know what he was hearing now. He knew only that it was none of the categories he had reference for. He walked down the stairs. He walked down the corridor. He stood in the open doorway of the recital hall. He stood there for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, which he also could not have articulated as a number, but which was approximately the duration of the final section of the Precipitato. He did not move. He did not announce himself. He stood in the doorway and listened with the full attention of someone who has spent 40 years inside music as a practitioner, and who has learned that the rarest thing music can be is what it was being in this room right now, fully, completely, urgently alive. Not performed, not executed, not demonstrated, alive. The technical level was extraordinary. He recognized that immediately within the first measure. The tempo was correct, and the octaves in the left hand had genuine weight behind them, and the right hand was doing what the right hand in this piece needed to do, which was to operate with total independence from the left at maximum velocity, without any of the mechanical quality that usually accompanies velocity, the sense of a technique performing rather than a musician playing. But the technical level was not the primary thing. He had heard technical level before. He had heard it in students and in professionals and in recordings and in the practice rooms of this building through walls and doors. Technical level did not do to him what this was doing. What it was doing was harder to name. It was the quality of privacy in the playing. She had been alone in this room. She had believed herself entirely alone, and she had played the piece the way it is supposed to be played, which is to say, as if the music were the only thing that was real and the playing were not a transaction with an audience but a conversation between the player and the thing the music was made of. He had spent 24 years trying to teach students to find that quality. Very few of them ever did, and those who did usually found it partially and occasionally. To hear it fully present, in a room he had believed was empty, from a person he had never associated with the playing of anything. He stood in the doorway, the last chord rang out, the silence came in behind it. He shifted his weight, and the floor spoke under him, and Elena stood immediately and reached for the cloth and apologized without turning around, the way a person apologizes when they have learned that apology is the efficient first response to being found somewhere they were not expected. He said, "Where did you study?" She turned. He looked at her clearly for the first time, not with the peripheral non-attention with which we look at people who are doing things we rely on but do not think about, but with full presence, the way he looked at students when they played something that required his full attention. He saw a woman in her early 50s with steady eyes and the particular quality of stillness around the face of someone who is feeling a great deal and has a long practice of keeping it on the inside. She said, "Kiev, a long time ago." "What is your name?" "Elena Vasquez," the pause, "Elena Petrova before." The name landed in him. He had heard it before or read it, or had it spoken to him at some conference or in some context that he could not immediately locate precisely, but that was there in his memory, making the specific disturbance that names make when you have heard them in relation to something significant, and then set them aside. He had been at a conference in Vienna in 1995, where someone had played a recording of the previous year's Kiev Young Artists Competition final round, and he had turned to his colleague and said something, and the colleague had said, "Whoever that is, we should watch for them." He had not watched, the years had continued. "The Kiev competition," he said, 1994. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the piano. He looked at her hands, the cloth in them, the cleaning gloves folded over the cart. He looked at her face again. "The winter recital is in 3 weeks," he said. She looked at him with the care of someone who needs to be certain they have understood correctly before they allow themselves to respond. He said, "I would like you to perform in it." The room held the sentence. The silence after it was full, not empty but full of everything Elena was processing in those seconds that she was not showing on her face. She was 21 in the blue dress. She was 28 holding a hand in a hospital room. She was 32 cleaning her first conservatory at 2 in the morning because the shift was available and she needed the income. She was 41 discovering the Whitmore building and choosing it deliberately. She was 52 years old with damp hands and a chamois cloth, and 11 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings behind her, and a burst pipe's worth of empty building around her, and a question to answer. "I would need to practice," she said. He looked at her with something that was more than a smile but less visible than one. "The hall is free every morning until 8. "The same piece?" she asked. "Whatever you choose," he said, "that is entirely your choice." She nodded once, small and complete. She turned to the fallboard and began to dust it. She heard him walk to the doorway. He stopped. He said clearly, "I have been teaching piano for 24 years. What I heard this morning is not something that happens in 24 years of teaching." Elena did not look up. She said, "Thank you, Professor." He left. She cleaned the hall exactly as she always cleaned it. She cleaned every surface she was supposed to clean, and several she was not required to clean, but chose to clean because the room deserved it. She set the Prokofiev score back on the stand at the same angle on the same page. She straightened the bench. She put on her cart gloves and wheeled the cart to the door. She stopped in the doorway. She turned back and looked at the piano in the morning light. She walked to the parking lot. She sat in her car. She put her hands in her lap. She sat like that for a long time. Then she pressed both hands over her face. And the 11 years came out of her, not noisily, not dramatically, the way grief finally exits when it has been held long enough and the person holding it has become large enough to let it go quietly, completely, in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning in December without anyone to witness it. She cried for a long time, then she dried her face, then she drove home. She ate breakfast standing at the counter, scrambled eggs which she made without thinking, while looking out the kitchen window at the street below and the gray December morning going about its work. She showered. She dressed in the clothes she wore when she was not working. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee in both hands and let the morning's events move through her without trying to organize them. This was something she had learned to do, the practice of letting significant things be significant without immediately deciding what to do about them. Then she went to the corner of her bedroom. The electric keyboard had been purchased 9 years ago from a used music shop. 73 keys, a sustain pedal, a small adjustable bench. She had bought it in installments over 3 months and had placed it in the corner of the bedroom and had begun to play it in the evenings with the headphones on, quietly, always when she was alone. She had never explained it to the few people who had been to her apartment and noticed it. No one had asked. A keyboard in the corner of a bedroom was not an unusual thing. She sat at it, she put the headphones on, she placed her hands on the keys. She began with scales, not as a warm-up but as an inventory, the methodical process of listening to each hand, each finger, each passage type, the way a craftsperson checks tools they have not used at full capacity in years. She listened without judgment and without hope. She simply listened to what was there. What was there was more than she had expected. The deep-level training, the habits built over years of intensive, serious work, the ways her body had learned to translate musical intention into physical movement at a level below conscious direction, had not dissolved. It had softened in places, there were roughnesses. The even flow in certain passage types had gaps where precision had loosened from disuse. Particular technical challenges would need to be rebuilt, but the architecture was standing. The foundations were sound. The bones of a serious pianist were there under the 11 years intact. She played for 2.5 hours and made herself stop before she wanted to. Then she sat in the quiet of her bedroom and felt the specific quality of someone who has just picked up something heavy and found it lighter than they feared. Not light, lighter, there is a difference. She went to the conservatory the next morning at 6:30. She was in the hall by 6:45. She practiced alone for 1 hour and 15 minutes before the first faculty member arrived. She came back the morning after that, and the morning after that. Professor Aldrin came on the 3rd morning and sat in the 2nd row without announcing himself and listened without speaking for 45 minutes. When she stopped, he said, "The left-hand octaves, you're managing them, you don't need to manage them." She had known. She had been doing it without realizing, a small protective pulling back before the peak of each figure. "I know," she said. "Don't protect it," he said. "It doesn't need protecting." She played the section again without pulling back. The octaves landed with their full weight, and the bench shuddered beneath her, and the room rang with the sound of someone not managing a piece but playing it. "There," he said one word, then again. This was how the 3 weeks went. Elena in the hall every available morning before the building filled, alone or with Aldrin listening, working methodically upward from the foundations of the technique to the piece itself. In the evenings at home, she played the keyboard with the headphones on, working specific passages, building the endurance the precipitato demanded, not general endurance but specific endurance, the body's ability to sustain full commitment for 5 minutes and 44 seconds without recovery, without let-up, without any measure in which the demand decreases. 3 weeks, not long. Enough for what Elena Vasquez was capable of bringing to the piece, which was something that had not been built in 3 weeks and would not be unbuilt in 11 years, and whose presence in the playing was not a product of the preparation, but the reason the preparation was possible at all. The recital program was printed on cream paper with the conservatory seal. Elena's name appeared forth. Beside it, Prokofiev Piano Sonata No. 7 in B-flat major, 3rd movement precipitato, no biography. She had not submitted one, and Professor Aldrin had asked twice and then stopped asking, which was the correct response. The hall filled to its 340 seats, students, faculty, parents, and a scattering of people from outside the conservatory who followed its events, the usual mix, the usual pre-concert hum of social activity and program reading and the small negotiations of shared armrests. Oliver was in the 4th row with his leather satchel on his lap. He had been told to be there by Professor Aldrin, without explanation. He had come curious, and had read the program and found Elena's name in the Prokofiev 3rd movement, and had felt a particular complicated thing. He had been working on that movement for 6 months and had not yet played it clean through even once, and reading that someone else was about to perform it in public did something specific to him that he was not proud of but also could not help. He put the program in his satchel and watched the stage. The first 2 performers played. Oliver watched them with real attention and appreciated what they were doing and filed it away in the portion of his mind that was always, at some level, in class. Then Elena came onto the stage. She was in a dark green dress, and she walked to the bench with the kind of steadiness that is not the same as the absence of feeling but is what feeling looks like when it has been fully accepted and is no longer fighting with the person who is having it. She sat, she adjusted the bench, she placed her hands in her lap, She looked at the keyboard. She did not look at the audience. This was not nerves, this was focus. The relevant thing in the room was the instrument and the music, and the 340 people were not the relevant thing yet. They would become relevant, the music would be for them, in the way music is always simultaneously for the player and for whoever hears it, but that exchange had not yet begun. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. The old gesture, she held it for exactly as long as her body told her to. Then she placed her hands on the keys. The opening chord of the Precipitato landed in the hall. 340 people stopped whatever was happening in their individual minds and became, in that moment, an audience. Not through any decision but through the simple reflex of attention being claimed by something that required it absolutely. The hall went still in the specific way it only goes still when whatever is happening on the stage is genuinely, actually happening, not being displayed but occurring in real time, with the full weight of a real person behind it. Alina played. She gave the left hand octaves their full weight. She did not slow at measure 47. She drove through the difficult passages with the specific confidence of someone who has done the work and knows what the work has built, and is not pretending to have more than she has, but is also not pretending to have less. The piece moved through the hall at the tempo it demanded, 184 beats per minute, and the hall received it and held it and reflected it back. And the audience sat in that sound and felt it the way you feel something that is too alive to be only experienced as music. Felt it in the chest, in the hands, in the small involuntary ways the body responds to things that move it. Oliver sat in the fourth row and the thinking stopped. This had never happened to him before. He was a person who thought during performances, analytically, helpfully, always with some part of his mind attending to the craft of what he was hearing. He had never sat in an audience and had the thinking simply stop because the music had made it impossible for anything else to be present. He sat there with his program in his hands and his eyes full of something he was not going to call what it was for a while yet, watching Alina play the piece he had been struggling with for 6 months, and he understood it, not analytically, not from the thinking. He understood it the way you understand something when you finally see it whole, when the thing you have been studying in parts becomes, for one moment, a single complete thing that exists all at once in front of you and you see what it is for. The final chord landed. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the hall came apart. People stood before they finished deciding to stand. The applause was the involuntary kind, the kind the body gives before the mind has constructed an opinion about whether to give it. All 340 people rising. Oliver was on his feet with the rest of them, his program falling from his hands to the floor, not noticing. Alina stood from the bench. She faced the room. She bowed a full bow, the bow she had learned on stages in her 20s, a complete lowering of herself toward the people who had heard her, not as a gesture of servitude but as an acknowledgement. This thing happened between us. You were necessary to it. I recognize that. She bowed 3 times. She walked off the stage. In the wings, Professor Aldrin was standing. He looked at her. She looked at him. Some things do not need language, and this was one of them. The video was 3 minutes and 58 seconds long, because Priya's phone had run out of storage space 42 seconds before the end. Priya was a second-year student who had been planning to film the faculty showcase that ended the program and had left her camera running out of inertia and had ended up with something she did not know what to do with until she got home and watched it on her laptop and sat in the quiet of her room for several minutes afterward. She posted it with a simple description: the woman who has cleaned this conservatory for 11 years. She played tonight. By the next morning, 40,000 views. By the evening, 400,000. By the end of the week, 4,200,000 and rising, and the number had stopped meaning anything comprehensible because the video had traveled beyond every context that could make the number meaningful and into the large formless space where things go when they have touched something in people that they did not know they wanted touched. Music publications in London and Warsaw and Prague and Buenos Aires shared it. A radio program in Prague played the first 2 minutes of it and then played 2 minutes of silence. A pianist in Seoul who had performed the Prokofiev Seventh at Carnegie Hall 3 years ago posted the video on his own account with no comment at all. The management agency in Toronto found Alina's contact information through the conservatory's administrative office, which had been receiving calls since the second day. Elena found out about it on the 9th morning from Francis in the administrative office, who knocked quietly on the supply room door and showed her the screen of a phone. Elena looked at the number. She handed the phone back. She said, "Thank you for telling me." She went back to her cart. She did not check the number again for several days. When she did, it had stopped being a number she could hold in her head. She answered some of the calls and emails. The management agency in Toronto she spoke with over 3 months before signing anything, because she was in no hurry and the agreement needed to be one she fully understood. The journalists she evaluated carefully, some of them she spoke with, and they wrote pieces that were honest representations of what had happened. Others she declined, not from shyness but from recognition. They wanted the cleaning woman story, the version where the surprise was the heart of it, where the extraordinary thing was that someone who cleaned floors could play the piano this way. That version did not interest her. She was not surprised by herself. She had always known what she had. She had set it down for reasons that had nothing to do with not having it anymore. The third interview she gave was the one that asked the right things. A journalist named Caroline Webb, who had been writing about music for 20 years, and who had listened to the video many times before she drove 3 hours to Elena's apartment on a February Saturday with a notebook and a voice recorder, and a willingness to sit with silence when it came. They sat at the kitchen table. Elena made tea. Caroline asked her questions about Kiev, about the competition, about the years she had stopped performing. She asked the questions carefully and listened to the answers carefully and did not try to fill the pauses with the next question before the pause was ready to end. She asked whether Elena had regretted the years away from performance. Elena said, "Regret is a word for when you made the wrong choice. I did not make the wrong choice. I made the only choice that was available to me and that was consistent with who I am. Dmitri needed me. I chose to be there. I would not undo that." Caroline waited. Elena looked at the window. She said, "The piano was the last place where he still felt close, the Prokofiev especially. He heard me play it on the night of the competition, the first night he really heard me play. Afterward he told me it was the moment he knew, he meant about us, not just that I could play but the moment he knew." She paused. "If I played it again fully in the way it deserved to be played, I was afraid it would be a completion of something, an ending. And I was not ready for that ending. So I kept the distance. And the piano was there on Tuesdays and Thursdays and I cleaned it and I kept the distance and that was enough. For a long time it was enough." Caroline said nothing. Elena said, "And then one morning I was in an empty room and I sat down and I played it and I discovered that I was not completing anything. I was not ending anything. I was carrying it forward, him forward. There is a difference between finishing something and taking it with you. I had confused those two things for 11 years. The silence after this lasted a long time. Caroline Webb did not fill it. That silence, Elena thought later, was the interview. Everything else was context. Her first professional concert since 1997 was scheduled for the following autumn. A hall in the city that held 600 people. The program was Elena's own, not conservative, not cautious, not the program of someone returning tentatively to something they had been away from, but the program of someone who had been away and had returned and knew exactly what they wanted to say. It sold out in 11 days. Elena wore dark gray. She stood in the wings before the concert began with her hands pressed flat against her thighs in the old gesture, and it felt exactly as it had always felt, which was exactly right. She walked onto the stage. 340 seconds into the first piece, she became unaware of the audience again, not because she had forgotten them, but because she was fully inside the music, and being inside the music and being aware of the audience in a self-conscious way were incompatible states. She was playing for them. She was playing from inside the music. These were not contradictions. In the fourth row, one seat had been left empty, with a program placed on it. She did not look at it, she knew it was there. She kept the cleaning job through the end of March. She came every Tuesday and Thursday and cleaned the conservatory the way she always had, because the work was honest and the building was a place she respected, and the job was not something to be embarrassed about or to leave hurriedly, because something better had come along. She left it when the concert bookings made her schedule genuinely incompatible with it, and she left with the appropriate notice period and a genuine thank you to the building manager and to Francis and to Harold, who was still there after 21 years and who had shown her the supply room on her first morning and who shook her hand on her last morning and said simply, "You did good work here." She had done good work here for 11 years. The work had its own value, independent of everything else that she was. On her last shift in the recital hall, she cleaned the piano one more time. She took her time with it. She polished the lid, she cleaned the pedals, she ran the cloth over the fallboard. She dusted the music stand, no score on it today. Oliver had retrieved the Prokofiev in January, coming in early and quiet and standing with it for a moment before rolling it into his satchel. She had not been in the hall when he came, but she had noticed the stand was empty the following Thursday and had known. She wiped each key with the chamois cloth, pressing each one lightly, attending to each one, the way she had always done it since Harold showed her how on her second day. At the end, she rested her hand on the keyboard. Flat, not pressing, just the weight of her palm against the keys, the same contact she had allowed herself for 11 years, neither more nor less. She held it for a moment longer than usual, then she picked up the cloth, folded it, put it on the cart. She walked to the doorway, she stopped. She did not turn around. She said in the quiet of the empty room, clearly but without drama, the way a person speaks to something they have spent a long time with, "Thank you. For the room, for the years, for the Tuesday and Thursday mornings, for the open score, for the empty building, for all of it." She walked to the parking lot. She drove home through the spring morning. The city was going about its business in the light, and she drove through it with the window down and the air coming in cold and clean. And she had a rehearsal at 2 in the afternoon and a concert in 6 weeks and a great deal of music ahead of her. 3 weeks later she passed Oliver in the corridor of the conservatory. She had come in to use the hall, by arrangement with Professor Aldrin, for a specific practice session she could not fit into the morning hours. Oliver was carrying his satchel and his Prokofiev score and the look of someone who has been working hard and is making progress and knows it. He stopped when he saw her. He said, "I got through measure 47 yesterday, clean through, both times I tried." She looked at him. He was earnest and proud and trying not to look too proud and not quite managing. She said, "How did it feel?" He thought about it, "Like I was finally inside it," he said, "instead of trying to get in from outside." She nodded. That was exactly right. She walked on toward the hall, and behind her she heard him open his satchel, and she did not look back. She had work to do. The morning was good. The piano was waiting. She sat at the bench. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She held the gesture for exactly as long as she needed to hold it. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began, and the music went out from her into the room, and the room received it, and it was the most natural thing in the world. It had always been the most natural thing in the world. She had simply needed to find her way back to it. She played. She had not always found it easy to return to the apartment in those first years after Dmitri died. The apartment they had shared together in Kiev no longer existed as a place she could go. She had given it up eventually during the long emigration process, and it had become something else. A concept, a memory, the specific quality of the light on a particular floor in the morning. In the country she moved to, she lived in 3 different apartments in the first 4 years, each one slightly more stable than the last, the way a life consolidates itself slowly after it has been scattered. The third apartment, the one she had now, she had lived in for 7 years. She knew it the way you know a place you have chosen to commit to. She knew the sound the pipes made in winter. She knew which neighbor came home late and which one left early. She knew the smell of the stairwell at different hours. It was hers in the particular way that a place becomes yours not through ownership, but through long occupation and the slow accumulation of small knowings. The keyboard in the bedroom corner she had bought 3 years into the apartment. She had walked past the used music shop 4 times over a week before going in. She had played 3 notes on the display model, standing at it with her coat still on and her bag over one shoulder, and the person behind the counter had looked up and then very carefully looked back down again, which was the right response. She had paid the first installment that afternoon. She had set the keyboard up in the corner of the bedroom the evening it arrived, and she had played it for 2 hours with the headphones on, and she had not cried, which surprised her. She had expected to cry. Instead she had felt something else, something quieter and harder to name, a familiarity, a homecoming of a very small and manageable scale. The music was still there in her hands in the ways she had been afraid it might not be. It was changed, roughened in places, less precise in others, but present, intact in the essential ways, waiting. She played the keyboard on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, after the conservatory, and on Sunday afternoons when the building had no cleaning schedule. She played other things than the Prokofiev. She played Schubert and Ravel and pieces by composers she had discovered after she had stopped performing, music she had come to late and that she thought of as her private inheritance from the years that had taken other things. She played simply, sometimes folk melodies she had known as a child, the key of songs that had been the background of her earliest memories, before she had understood herself as a musician and was simply a small person in a city full of sound. She did not play the Prokofiev. She owned the score, a copy she had bought years ago and kept in the drawer of the bedside table where other people kept books or journals. She had not opened it. She had kept it there the way you keep something you are not ready for, contained. Near but not active, waiting for a different version of yourself. The score Oliver left on the stand was not her copy. It was his, a clean edition with pencil fingerings in the margins, the kind of annotations a young person makes when they are still negotiating with a piece rather than inhabiting it. She had read those annotations while she stood at the stand. She had thought about what they said about how he was approaching the piece, where he was comfortable and where he was uncertain, which passages he had flagged as requiring extra attention, the particular measure he had circled 3 times in red pencil, which was 47, which was the measure everyone circled. She had stood at the stand on that first Thursday reading his marginal notes and had felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific quality of a teacher, not the distance of a listener but the engaged attention of someone who could help. She had set the score back on the stand and picked up her cloth and said nothing to anyone and gone on with her day. But she had come back to it every visit, stood longer each time, read further, let herself be in the piece in the only way she was allowing herself to be in it, through the notation, through the page, through the fingertip she ran along the printed notes, not pressing, not playing, only reading. And then the pipe, and then the empty building. And then the bench beneath her and the keys under her hands and 22 minutes that had been, in their own quiet way, the most important 22 minutes she had spent in 11 years. What she did not know and would not know for several months was that Professor Aldrin had heard about the video not from social media but from a former student of his named Nina, who had become a professional pianist, and who sent him a text message on the second day after the recital that said only, "Is this your conservatory?" She had attached a link. He had watched the video 3 times. Then he had sat in his office for a long time doing the specific kind of thinking that happens when something you had hoped for and stopped expecting arrives suddenly and requires you to recalibrate. He had, in his 24 years of teaching, encountered very few players of Alina's level. Not none teaching at the level the Whitmore Conservatory maintained meant encountering excellent players regularly, and occasionally extraordinary ones. But the quality he had heard in Alina on that Tuesday morning in December was not simply about technical level or even about musicality in the conventional sense. It was about something harder to acquire and almost impossible to teach, the quality of a player whose relationship to the music is not professional but fundamental. Not someone who plays the piano but someone who is a pianist in the same way they are a person. The music not as something they do but as something they are made of. He had tried to teach that quality for 24 years. He had succeeded partially, occasionally. He had never tried to teach it to someone who already had it. What he had offered her that morning in the doorway was not charity. It was not a generous impulse or a professional gesture. It was the response of someone who had just heard something extraordinary and understood that the extraordinary thing needed to be heard by more than one person. He had told her the hall was free until 8. He had meant, use it. He had not specified what help, if any, he was offering to provide. He had been surprised that first morning she returned that she was already there when he arrived. He had been more surprised by what he heard through the door before he went in, the quality of the work she was doing, alone, at 6:45 in the morning. The methodical, patient, rigorous process of a serious musician rebuilding from the foundations. He had sat in the second row and listened and had waited until she stopped before he said anything, and what he said was true and specific and the most useful thing he could offer, which was to name precisely the one thing she was still protecting that she did not need to protect. She had said she knew. She had played it again without protecting it. That was the only moment in 3 weeks where he had to tell her something she didn't already know she needed to hear. The rest of the 3 weeks were a collaboration between 2 people who were both fully committed to the same thing, which is the best kind of collaboration and the rarest. Oliver did get through measure 47. He got through it the week after the recital on a Thursday morning when he was alone in one of the practice rooms with his score and his stubborn patience and the particular determination of someone who has watched something played at the level it is meant to be played and who cannot unknow what he has seen. He played the measure. He played it again. He played the passage leading into it and through it and out the other side. He played it at the right tempo. Both times were clean. He put his hands in his lap and sat at the bench for a few minutes. Then he played the whole third movement from the beginning. He got through it with 3 small errors that he noted, and that would need correction, and that were, for a first complete run at tempo, not what mattered. What mattered was that the piece had become navigable. Something had shifted in his understanding of it on the evening of the recital. Something had organized itself through the act of watching Alina play it, the way that watching someone do a thing at its highest level reorganizes your understanding of what the thing actually is. He had been approaching the precipitato as a sequence of technical problems to be solved in order. What it actually was, he understood now, was a single thing, a complete statement with its own internal logic and momentum, and the individual technical challenges were not problems to be solved but characteristics to be inhabited. He called his teacher the next morning, not Professor Aldrin, but the teacher he had been working with since he was 14, a woman named Dorothy Graham in the city where he had grown up. He told her he had gotten through measure 47. Dorothy said, "What changed?" He thought about how to explain it and found that the explanation had the same shape as the experience, simple and accurate and not fully adequate. He said, "I watched someone who was completely inside it, and then I understood what inside it means." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good, now do it again tomorrow." He did it again the next day, and the day after. It got cleaner each time. The piece began to feel like a place he could go to rather than a place he was trying to force his way into. He did not think too much about this, he just went there. There was a woman named Grace who had cleaned the Whitmore Conservatory alongside Alina for 6 of the 11 years. Grace was from a different part of the world entirely, had come to the country through a different path, and had found her way to the same building through the same general combination of practical necessity and luck that brings a great many people to the places they end up. She and Alina had worked together with the particular closeness of people who spend many early mornings in the same building without talking much, which is its own kind of intimacy. They knew each other's habits and rhythms and the specific way each of them went about the work. They did not talk about their lives outside the building very much. This was not from lack of friendliness, but from a shared understanding that the lives outside the building were their own. Grace had not been at the recital. She had not known Alina was going to play. She had found out about the video the same way most of the building found out, through the informal network of the staff that processes information faster than the official channels. She had come to work the Tuesday after the recital and found Alina in the supply room at her usual time doing her usual things, and had stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, simply, "I heard." Alina had said, "I know." Grace had said, "You should have told me." Alina had considered this. Then she said, "I was not sure it was going to happen until it happened." Grace had nodded slowly. "Fair," she said. She picked up her cart. She said, "You were always very careful with the piano." Alina said, "Yes." "I always thought that was because you liked it," Grace said. "I did not know it was because you knew it." Alina looked at her. She said, "Both." Grace nodded again, and they had gone about their morning, and that had been the end of it, which was exactly the right amount. There were days in those 3 weeks of preparation when Alina's hands refused to cooperate, not from illness or injury, but from the accumulation of 11 years of partial use. There were passages that required a speed and precision that had softened, that the body was rebuilding on a cellular level, and that could not be hurried. She had done this before, the process of retraining, of rebuilding muscle memory that had become imprecise, of closing the gap between what the music required and what the body was currently producing. She had done it as a teenager and in her 20s, and she did it now with the patience of someone who has done it enough times to know that the gap closes, and that the only way it closes is through patient repetition. There were also days when her hands did something that surprised her, days when a passage came out cleaner than she had expected, faster than she had been working toward, with a quality that she had not consciously produced but that was there, delivered by the body from some store she had not known was still full. These days she noted without becoming attached to them, because the body's generosity could not be relied upon, and the work was the only thing that was reliable. In the last week before the recital, she played the full third movement through at tempo every morning. It landed differently each time, some mornings sharper, some mornings with a particular quality of flow that she thought of privately as the piece being willing. She noted the variations without judgment. She continued, The day before the recital, she played it twice in the hall in the early afternoon. Then she stopped. She had learned decades ago that the day before a performance is not the day for more practice. It is the day for trust, for trusting the work you have done, for letting the body consolidate what the mind has been directing, for giving the whole system the quiet it needs to show up fully the next day. She left the conservatory at noon. She went home. She made lunch. She read for 2 hours. She went to bed early and slept well, which she had always been able to do before performances, which she had always known was not something everyone could do and which she had always been quietly grateful for. In the morning she woke and she was ready. After the concert in the autumn, the first professional performance since 1997, there was a reception in the lobby of the hall. Elina stood with a glass of water and spoke to people who came to speak with her, and she was gracious and present and genuine in the way she was always genuine, which was completely and without performance. She spoke to a young woman who was 17 and had been studying piano for 9 years, and who came over with her mother and who shook Elina's hand and said, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to moderate sincerity for social comfort, "I want to play like you do." Elina looked at her. The girl was serious. She had the look of someone who has already decided something important and is just waiting for the time and opportunity to demonstrate it. Elina said, "Then play every day, not to get better. Play because it is the only honest response you have to the fact that music exists in the world. Do that every day and the rest follows." The girl's mother looked at Elina with an expression that was not quite comprehension, but was in the vicinity of it. The girl herself just nodded, the way people nod when something confirms what they already secretly knew. Elina talked to several more people. She was kind to all of them. She went home in a cab and let herself into the apartment and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not thinking, just being in the apartment in the specific way that you are in your own space after something significant has happened, and the significance needs room to settle. Then she went to the corner of her bedroom. She sat at the small keyboard. She put her hands on the keys. She did not put on the headphones. She played, and the music went into the room and into the walls and out through the walls into the night, and it did not matter who heard it or whether anyone did. She played for a long time, past the hour she usually stopped, because the music was good and the night was long and she had nowhere else she needed to be. She played until she was ready to sleep. Then she stopped and she sat for a moment in the quiet of her bedroom, and then she went to bed. In the morning she woke early. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the street below in the early gray light. She was 52 years old. She had been a cleaning woman and she had been a touring pianist and she had been a wife and she had been a person who was alone and she had been all of these things at once in varying proportions across the years. She was all of them now. She was going to go on being all of them in whatever proportions the next years brought. This did not feel like a problem. It felt like the truth. She finished her coffee. She dressed. She drove to the conservatory, where the hall was free until 8, where she had work to do, where the Steinway waited in the morning light the way it had always waited, patient and enormous and completely ready for whatever she was going to bring to it. She brought everything. She always had. The concert management agency was run by a man named Philip Drummond, who had been in the business for 30 years and who had heard in 30 years a great many stories about musicians returning to performance after long absence. Most of those stories ended one of two ways. The musician found that the absence had cost too much and the return was a diminished thing, or the musician found that the absence had in some way deepened the playing, and the return was better than what had come before. He had learned over 30 years that you could not always predict which kind of story you were in. When he heard the 4 minutes and 16 seconds of the video from the Whitmore Conservatory winter recital, he sat at his desk for a long time before calling his assistant and saying to clear his afternoon, because he needed to think. He had represented serious pianists for 20 years. He had taken on 3 people in that time who he considered to be at the level that required genuine management rather than booking services, which was a distinction that mattered to him. He was a careful man. He did not move quickly. He had learned that the musicians who needed careful management were precisely the musicians who should not be rushed, who should not be positioned before they were ready, who should not be marketed before the marketing could honestly support what it claimed. He watched the video again. Then he wrote Elina a letter, not an email but an actual letter, typed on the agency's stationery and mailed to the conservatory's general address, because he thought that a letter was the appropriate way to begin a conversation that deserved to begin formally and with care. The letter arrived at the conservatory and was passed to Elena through Francis in the administrative office, who delivered it on a Tuesday morning with the particular expression of someone who has read the outside of an envelope and found it consequential. Elena had read the letter at her cart and then put it in her bag and thought about it during the rest of her shift. She called Philip Drummond 3 days later. They spoke for an hour. He asked her what she wanted from the next period of her career. She said she had not thought about it yet in those terms. He said he understood that and that there was no hurry, and that what he was offering was a conversation rather than a proposition, and that the conversation could take as long as it needed to take. It took 3 months. By the end of those 3 months, Elena had a clearer picture of what she was actually available for, how many performances per year, what kind of venues, what repertoire, the specific ways her life could accommodate a return to professional performing without the life losing the shape she had built for it over 11 years. Philip Drummond had listened carefully to all of this and had not tried to argue her into a larger or faster ambition. He had said, "I can work with what you've described." She had believed him and signed. What she had described was modest by the standards of serious professional performance, but larger than what her life had contained before. 6 to 8 concerts per year, halls of moderate size. Repertoire built on the music she had always played and expanded by music she had come to love during the quiet years. She would not tour in the way she had briefly toured in her mid-20s. She would not give up the apartment or the morning practice sessions or the particular quality of a life built around music rather than around the management of a music career. Philip Drummond had nodded at all of this. He had said, "What you're describing is a musician's life, not a performer's career. There's a difference." He had said this approvingly. She had thought about this, then she had said, "I was always a musician who happened to perform. I was never a performer who happened to play music." He had written this down, which she had not expected, and had later used it in the press material for her autumn concert, accurately attributed. There was one more thing she did before her last shift at the conservatory. She went to the building early, before her cleaning schedule began, and she went to Professor Aldrin's office and knocked on the open door. He looked up from his desk. She said, "I wanted to thank you, not in the way I thanked you before, which was quick and insufficient, properly." He looked at her steadily. He was a man who received gratitude without deflecting it, which was rarer than it should have been. She said, "I had decided that the piano was something I was going to be near, but not inside. I had made that decision and I had kept to it for 11 years, and I had believed it was permanent. You changed that. You changed it by asking the right question and then getting out of the way while I answered it." He said, "You answered it yourself." "Yes," she said, "but you asked it, that was not nothing." He said, "No, it was not nothing." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "What you played that morning in December when the building was empty, that was not the result of 3 weeks of practice. You know that." "Yes," she said. "It was 30 years," he said. 30 years and then 11 years of keeping it safe and then one morning of being willing to spend it. That is what I heard, not technique. Willingness. She stood in the doorway of his office and thought about this. She said, "He would have liked you, I think, Dmitri. He had very little patience for people who confused technique with music." Professor Aldrin said, "Good, I have very little patience for it myself." A pause. "I'm sorry I never met him." She said, "So am I." She thanked him again, the brief way, the efficient way, and left his office, and went to collect her cart and begin her final shift. The autumn was gold when the concert came. The city in October had its particular quality of light, lower and more amber than summer, with the shadows longer and the evenings arriving earlier, and the sense of a season that was getting ready to be something else. Elena drove to the hall in the late afternoon and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. She was not nervous in the way she had sometimes been nervous before performances in her 20s. The nervousness of her 20s had been connected to the future, to what a performance might build or fail to build, to how it would be received, to where it would position her. She did not have that relationship to the future anymore. The future would be what it was. The concert would be what she made it. The relationship between those two facts was more straightforward than it had seemed to her when she was younger. She went in, she warmed up for 40 minutes in a practice room behind the stage. She did her scales. She played through the sections she always checked. She dressed and sat in the green room while the hall filled on the other side of the wall. A stagehand knocked on the door and said, 5 minutes. She stood, she pressed her hands flat against her thighs. The gesture. The cells remembered. The body settling itself for what it was about to do, the way it had always settled, the way it had been settling since she was 17 years old in the wings of her first significant competition, with her heart large and fast, and the music ahead of her. She walked onto the stage. The hall was full. The lights were warm. She sat at the bench and did not look at the audience and pressed her hands into her lap and let everything quiet. She thought of one thing, and one thing only, in those final seconds before she began. She thought of a wall in a rehearsal building in Kiev, and a knock on that wall, and the knock she had given back, and the cello line that had answered. Then she placed her hands on the keys. And the music began. And it was everything.